less money out, less value out than the money that you've put in.
In his speech to the Conservative conference, the Chancellor Jeremy Hunt defended his decision to prioritise cutting inflation instead of the tax cuts demanded by some in his party. He's announced a civil service recruitment freeze. Donald Trump says a civil fraud case against him in New York is a politically motivated scam. He's on trial accused of inflating his assets and his own net worth from 2011 to 2021 to obtain favourable bank loans. The stabbing of a 16-year-old boy in North London last night is being treated as murder. He was killed in Edmonton. No one has been arrested. Flags at Manchester City's Etihad Stadium are flying at half-mast following the death of former striker Francis Lee, who was 79. In the city, the FTSE 100 closed down 97 points at 75.10. The pound buys $1.21 and €1.15. LBC weather: rain across much of England and Wales tonight. Clear spells and showers elsewhere. Lows of between 9 and 15 degrees. From Global's newsroom for LBC, I'm Andy Ivy.
This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale.
Hello, a very good evening. It's 2 minutes past 8 on LBC. Welcome to Monday's Cross Question. It's Iain Dale live from the Conservative Party conference in Manchester. With me on the panel we have Anthony Browne, Conservative MP for South Cambridgeshire, Justine Greening, former Education Secretary and Social Mobility Campaigner, and Sebastian Payne, Director of the Onward think tank. If you'd like to ask them a question, all you need to do is dial 0345 6060 973. You can text 84850 and say, Alexa, send a comment to LBC. And you can watch us on Global Player.
Call 0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross Question with Iain Dale. This is LBC.
Did you notice I missed my cue then? These things happen at party conference, don't they? Now, let's go straight to our first caller. It's David in Enfield. Hello, David.
Good evening, everyone. Does the panel think that this is the worst Conservative government ever?
Well, we've got three Conservatives to answer that question. Justine Greening.
Well, I think probably the Liz Truss debacle last year does set a low benchmark, unfortunately, for the party. So I think it's better than that. But I also think for people at this conference, they need more to believe in than a party in a government that's just stopping doing things and cutting down on this, clamping down on that. I think what people really want is a bit of a sense of a future and aspiration and things to believe in and some positive, constructive messages from the party.
I suppose it depends what David... Well, in fact, let's go back to him. What do you mean by this Conservative government? Do you mean the last few years, or do you mean going back to 2010?
Yeah, since 2010.
Since 2010, so the whole 13 years. Now, Anthony, you're a Conservative MP. I doubt whether you're going to say, David, you know, you're absolutely right. This has been a terrible government. Well, yeah, and I'm really sorry. I'm going to resign because I think it's all terrible. But, I mean, do you understand David's sentiments?
So I do understand the sentiments, but it's been a really, really difficult time. I mean, we came in 2010 at the back end of the global financial crisis. 2010 was a long time ago, which really wrecked the global economy, and we suffered from that massively. We've then had, you'll have different views on Brexit, but there was then the global pandemic, there's a cost of living crisis, Russian invasion of Ukraine. All of these have caused real problems for governments around the world. All have struggled to deal with it. But if you look at economic growth, which is obviously a big thing that people are concerned about, our economy has grown faster than Germany, faster than France, faster than Italy, faster than Spain.
Only just, though. I mean, it's still anemic.
Yeah,
isn't it?
But economic growth is anemic across the Western world. It is a global problem, certainly for developed countries. This slow pace of growth, and since the financial crisis, that's why, one thing I totally agree with Liz Truss about is we do need to focus on growth. We need to get the economy going again. But actually, the UK has done better than most other major European countries. It's done better than Japan, third highest in the G7. And if you're worried about the environment, just because obviously Rishi made his net zero commitment, we've also cut our CO2 emissions per capita about 40% since 2010, twice as fast as the EU, twice as fast than the G7 average, faster than any other G7 countries. And all those are great, really great, significant achievements. So the worst ever? Absolutely not.
Now, Seb, you've been sitting there for the last 3 or 4 minutes thinking, oh my God, I'm trying to apply for a Conservative seat. I better watch what I say here.
So what I'm going to say here is to roll back to my time as a political journalist, where I went to almost as many party conferences as you've been to, Ian.
No. In fact, I've been to more party conferences than you've been alive.
And I think the 2 party conferences that stick out in my mind for being pretty much the bottom of the barrel, number one was the Liz Truss government.
Yeah.
And I mean, I'm not sure you could actually call that a government, because as we know, she was outlived by a piece of lettuce. Exactly. So that one was not really particularly spectacular at all. I think the thing about this conference is that it's in a transition period, because Rishi Sunak's been Prime Minister for almost a year at this point, and we were in a pretty dire situation this time last year when literally the whole government was falling apart at the conference, where Liz Truss had to bin the 45p top rate of tax and the government's authority was sapping away. The situation has stabilised massively since then, but I completely agree with what Justine has said on this. We do need to have that bigger vision, that more ambitious idea on where we're going, and all eyes are on Mr Sunak. This is his first party conference, and it could be the last before the general election, whenever it comes next year. And so I think all eyes from the media and from party activists is going to be, where are we going and what is the journey you're taking us on? So people trying to make judgments about where it is and see where it goes.
The natural question, though, in response to that is, well, okay, you're going to outline your vision, say we all quite like the vision, but how can we trust you to deliver on it if you haven't done in 13 years?
So first of all, you've obviously got the fact that Mr Sunak set 5 pledges and he's making progress on some of them.
Are you all told you have to call him Mr Sunak now?
Or would it prefer I call him Prime Minister?
I don't care.
Rishi.
It's just something.
Right, well, if Anthony Browne can say Rishi, then I'll say Rishi then, if that was just being polite about the Prime Minister. But I think those 5 pledges obviously are setting out a way of him showing he can deliver and do stuff. And if you look at the Windsor framework, you look at the Horizon deal that was done in the EU, he is getting stuff done. And I think what the message he'll be saying to the country now at the election is, I've had a bit of time, I've used that to get stuff done, here's where we're heading, give us a mandate to do it. And the next election is going to be a change election. It's not just business the same, it's not just another government in the last 13 years. It is going to be about Rishi Sunak's first term and what he would do with the country if he has a mandate of his own.
Anthony, you wanted to come in.
Well, just to agree with Justine and Seb, that actually people vote on the future, not the past. As Winston Churchill found out in 1945, it saved the country from Nazism, and he was still voted out because Clement Attlee offered a better vision of the future. And we do need to sort out these 5 pledges, just to have the licence to be heard. But actually, we'll win or lose the election on what we're offering for the next 5 years. And that is really important, that we set out a positive constructive vision about aspiration, about hope, about people being able to lead better lives. And that's what we need to set out.
And I think it's really important to reflect back in 1945. The country had gone through a terrible time, obviously, and we were in a need to rebuild. I think if we got to that point and the government had said, well, I don't think we can afford to do the NHS and welfare state now, I'm sorry, where would we be now, in a sense? Actually, now is a time coming out of COVID, and I agree, it is about change. Britain, coming out of COVID, feels like it needs to be different to the one that went in. The one that went in wasn't working for enough people, and as Anthony said, the Conservative government came in 2010. We had a huge financial crisis to sort out and public finances to sort out. But actually, most of this time the Conservatives have spent in government has been after Brexit, actually. If you think about it, we went 2010 to 2015, but 2016 onwards, 7, going to be 8 years of this time will have been post-Brexit.
Well, Brexit didn't actually happen until 2020.
But the political turmoil from Brexit began in 2016 is what I'm trying to say. I guess post-COVID, what I'm saying is, there's a genuine question of what kind of country are we trying to build? This is a moment to decide to be different. I think on that basis, potentially Rishi Sunak can make a debate about this being a moment for change. But him as a moment for change, I think, is a lot harder. And he hasn't framed it in those terms of how everyone else outside the Westminster bubble feels at the moment. We all feel like we want to move forward, but we want to not just know about growth, not just know about where we're going. We want to know why we're going in this direction and why it's going to be better.
Right, 2 follow-ups here. Pete says, if this isn't the worst Tory government in history, which one was? Now you've really got to search back now.
Well, we answered that with Liz Truss, didn't we?
I think all three of us agreed on that, yeah.
Yeah, but David said 2010 to now rather than just picking out Liz Truss.
That is now.
But you're going to stick with
I'm going to stick with Liz Truss, yeah.
All right. Okay.
Justine?
No?
I think it's it's just a fact, isn't it? I mean, I know that we're expressing opinions, but I think if you look at the
I could make an
economic
argument for Ted Heath.
cases, but that's not since 2010.
Not solving the economic issues or the EEC.
Don't get me started. This is aimed at you, I think. Michael in Ham. Given the Tories' record over the last 13 years, why would anyone want to stand for them?
Well, obviously, I wouldn't agree with what Mike has to say about the record. I think there's been a lot of good things the party has done in government. If you think about the reforms for education that have unleashed opportunity for millions of people across the country with academies and free schools. If you think about welfare reform, about universal credit, I think getting us through the COVID pandemic, our world-leading role in the war in Ukraine, all that stuff is very exciting and significant. And ultimately, if you're someone like me who's trying to aspire to be in the House of Parliament, stand for the Conservatives, it's about the values the party has, and they're my values, and I think they're fundamentally the same as the British people. And they understand there's been some ups and downs, and I think when it comes to election, they will give us a fair hearing.
You gave up a very successful career in political journalism. I mean, everyone in the political lobby sort of admired your work. And okay, you're now working for a think tank, but it's kind of a bit of a stepping stone, isn't it? I mean, a lot of people think that's quite something to do, to give up a stellar political journalistic career, to go into the House of Commons at a time when, in all likelihood, you would be in opposition for quite a considerable amount of time.
Well, obviously, Ian, we'll be
totally illogical, isn't
We'll be
it?
going to the House of Commons for a fifth historic term. I don't buy your contention in all likelihood. Exactly, I knew you would enjoy that. My view on it was, Ian, that I loved my job at the Financial Times, and before that, The Spectator and The Washington Post. Had written 2 books, and I'd observed politics for a long time, 12 years at various institutions, and it struck me we were coming to an inflection point about where we are heading. And the fact is, there's some massive challenges facing this country, and even before journalism, I trained as a computer scientist, and I can see what's coming down the tracks in terms of automation and AI, and it struck me there weren't people enthusiastic enough about this in the House of Commons to do something about it. And I think ultimately you could sit on the sidelines. I could have sat being a journalist, writing articles, appearing on LBC, for example, and having quite a nice life. But instead I could look and think, actually, there's some big things to fix, some big things to get stuck into, and meanwhile, if in that unforeseeable circumstance the Conservatives don't win the next election, there will be a project to rebuild the party and rebuild those ideas, and that's a really exciting thing, because I think if Labour do win the election, they're not going to have the ideas to fix the country, they're not going to get our growth going again, and it'll be incumbent on us Conservatives to win that argument.
Justine, you decided to go in the opposite direction. You'd had a very successful political career, you'd had several jobs in cabinet, then at the last election you decided not to stand again. Have you ever come to regret that decision?
No, because I think since leaving Parliament I've been able to drive change in the rest of the country, and actually it sometimes has felt like Parliament's got stuck, and I found it really inspiring to work with businesses, universities, public sector organisations on how they can deliver social mobility, and you've been part of that work, Ian, as well. And I think it's impossible not to listen to some of these leaders, if you like, in the rest of the country who care passionately about levelling up and social mobility, and not be really inspired by some of the work that they're doing. My view is that we know how to level up, actually. The answers are already out there, and so my work is really about finding those answers and working out how we can scale them up. And I think that's the big opportunity for whether you're Labour or Conservative coming in after the next election. It's understanding that there's a policy agenda in Whitehall, but actually a lot of day-to-day change happens through other people, it's businesses, it's civil society, and actually it's that change, in a sense, that really needs to be unleashed. And this almost old-style school of, thinking that, if I'm a minister I can change that law and everything changes. It's not as simple as that, and government really needs to be an enabler for the rest of Britain to be able to change.
And Anthony, you were elected in 2019, you're not fed up yet?
No, not at all. And actually, just picking up on the point that Seb and Justine were saying, I was a political journalist as well before I did a couple of other things and then entered Parliament. And I was a journalist for 20 years, Times, BBC, Observer. The reason why I gave up is because you're actually always just writing about other people doing things. You're a commentator on the side of the pitch going, Yabu sucks, you're always trying to tear people down. Whereas actually, the people that make a difference are the people who try and do things. And actually that's a far greater challenge. And you can do that in Parliament. You've got a platform there, whether you're just a backbencher or a minister. Justine's doing it in her own way. You can do that sort of campaign in other ways. But I'm absolutely not. It's been a fantastic experience. I hope to be re-elected. I hope to be re-elected as part of fifth Conservative term of Conservative government, and really be able to implement a lot of the changes that I think the country needs, about aspiration, about the values that, as Seb Payne was saying, for the country, encouraging enterprise.
Right, David, thank you very much for your question. We'll move on to other subjects in just a few moments' time with our panel here in Manchester. You're listening to LBC's Cross Question. It's 16 minutes past 8.
This is LBC. Leading Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale. Alexa, send a comment to LBC.
Anthony Browne is with us, Conservative MP for South Cambridgeshire. Now, what does that include, South Cambridgeshire?
So it includes the southern bit of Cambridge City, so
right.
Addenbrooke's Hospital for those who live there, and 73 villages. I've got one town, which is Camborne, a new town, first built 20 years ago. But the villages of Shelford and Swavesey.
I know them well.
And the village of Falmere, where I grew up.
Well,
and
marvellous.
Foxton, where my parents live.
Justine Greening is here, former Education Secretary and Social Mobility Campaigner, and Sebastian Payne, Director of the Onward think tank. Right, let's go to Chris in Richmond. Hello, Chris.
Good evening, Ian. Good evening, panel. Following Suella Braverman's speech last week, does the Conservative Party still believe in multiculturalism?
Sir.
I think it does, and I think how where you define multiculturalism is not a straightforward thing. And when I heard the Home Secretary speak, I remember reflecting what Trevor Phillips said many years ago, who's a Labour politician who's now works for Sky News, and he had worked for the Equality and Human Rights Commission. He came out and said there are big problems with multiculturalism, and there are areas where there should have been some more integration of people who've come to this country and talked a lot about British values. That's what I think the Home Secretary was trying to get at. But the fact is,
well, she did it in a pretty cack-handed way.
I think when you look at what other politicians have said at this conference, I interviewed James Cleverly on stage at an event yesterday, and I put that question to him, and he highlighted the fact of the success story we've had of integration in this country, you know, much more successful than America and France and other countries that have seen the similar term change in the makeup of its population over recent decades. So I think that's the thing we should focus on, is the success of that, but without, while acknowledging we could be more robust in promoting British values and integration into those.
But why didn't she put it that way? Because what she did was whip up anti-immigrant sentiment in her remarks. I'm sure Chris, the caller, would probably agree with that.
I mean, obviously, you'd have to. I'm not in Suella Braverman's head, so I don't know what she was thinking.
But when you
there.
heard, I mean, I don't know if you watched the whole speech. I did, and I felt it made me feel profoundly uncomfortable. And I think I know what your game is. I know why you're doing this, and just stop it.
I guess what she was trying to get at, in her own way, in her own language, was this question about where the values are and are you promoting them, whereas you seem to be alluding that she was trying to get to something else. But I think ultimately, if you look at the core of what she was trying to believe about those values and about integration, that's something most people in the Conservative Party would agree with, but celebrating the success. And she did in her speech note that, Iain. She did note. And if you look at her background and the background of the Prime Minister and the Chancellor, they are, again, successes of integration of different communities into British values.
But she didn't mention that once.
I think she was getting across the benefits we've had in it. Her own life story does speak to that.
Does it? Because, I mean, if it does, she should articulate that, but she didn't, did she, Justine?
No, she didn't at all. And she's not just speaking on her own behalf, actually. She's speaking on behalf of course, the Conservative Party, as a member of the Cabinet, and she's speaking on behalf of the country because she was representing us as our Home Secretary. So I don't believe either she was articulating the government's view, which I think on something as sensitive this is actually quite a serious matter, actually. So I think if it's there's the issue itself and how important it is to have a measured tone on such important issues for Britain. And secondly, then there's the politics and how the party thinks it's going to establish lines of trust with many communities across the country when it talks like that about the levels of integration. And I speak as somebody who represented for a long time a very mixed community in London. And I can say that I felt like you, Iain. I was profoundly depressed, and I think it missed the massive contribution day to day that all communities make, notwithstanding, of course, some of the challenges. But there are some areas in politics where you have to talk incredibly carefully, and I don't think she brought the care and attention to it that you'd expect of an elected politician, let alone somebody who's in a cabinet, let alone somebody who's in a senior position in the cabinet as Home Secretary, is responsible for that policy area themselves.
Do you think that the kind of liberal conservatism that you espouse, that David Cameron espoused, that I like to think I do you think that's becoming a thing of the past in the Conservative Party, and it's reverting to a sort of social conservatism that I mean, people call it populism, people can call it all sorts of different things, but in a sense it's reverting back to the sort of more authoritarian days of the Conservative Party?
It may be. There are certainly some voices in the party that want to take it down that route. But there's a reason why David Cameron ended up leading a party that had been in opposition for a long time. And that's because that's the route it had tried.
Yeah.
And I spent 5 years in opposition, and I can tell you, you get pretty fed up of being in opposition very quickly when you lose every single vote and the government really has a majority, so it doesn't really need to pay attention to you at all. And I think when I look at the discipline the Conservative Party had to have in order to win, that's the kind of difference I see today. Is where's that discipline of message and desire to actually present a unified front to the electorate as a party that people want to buy into. And I think if the party here, I did a fringe and literally the next person in the room was going to be Liz Truss doing her own version of the economic strategy the party should have. Down the road there was another group apparently launching a manifesto on the European Human Rights Commission. It's just all sorts of different factions. There's the quote-unquote new Conservatives who have launched as well. They're a different group again. I think it's bewildering for people outside in the public to get a sense of what the party stands for, and whichever faction you agree with or whatever, it's becoming almost less important than the fact that for the public at large they have less and less of an idea every day that goes by about what the party stands for.
Anthony.
So coming back to your original question about Suella Braverman, so I didn't hear the speech, but clearly leading politicians, indeed all politicians, have to choose their words very, very carefully. And I think I'm going to agree with Seb Payne's points that we need to make sure there is integration between different communities in the UK. But I actually think the UK is one of the most successful multiracial and multicultural societies there is on the planet. It is really quite extraordinary. We have a Hindu Prime Minister, we have a Buddhist Home Secretary, as it happens. We've got a Jewish Defence Secretary, and that's all done. It's a great sort of illustration of the success of the UK in bringing different communities together. But on Justine's point about discipline, I mean, all political parties are clearly broad churches, and and that's great. You wouldn't want everyone thinking exactly the same thing, but you do need discipline to win elections. You do. I know at the moment there is real discipline about Rishi being the leader, for example. There is no one, certainly no MP who thinks there might be any other leader. We're all absolutely behind him, but there are different views around that. But
I could sit here now and name you at least 10.
Not by the next general election.
Yeah.
It's not.
Yeah.
Well, they're not saying that to me.
But I could.
We do need discipline clearly as a party, and we need to set out, as we were saying earlier, a vision for the future, and all sell that vision to the public. And it's important the public know what we as a party stand for, and the general values. The reason why I'm a Conservative, and why I think that the country as a whole has broadly Conservative values, and that we'll help deliver them on their aspirations. But it is inevitable after 13 years of power that actually there are different voices out there, and some of them you don't have the same hunger for power, and that's a challenge for the current Prime Minister compared to a leader of an opposition. You look at Tony Blair in '97, the Labour Party was desperate for power by that time, and David Cameron, when Justine was a shadow minister, the Conservative Party is really, really hungry for power.
But there's
Discipline's
something
easier then, but we still need it.
It's interesting, and there's something about it which is, it's more than even, if you can't run yourselves, how can you run the country? It's actually about your ability to be effective. So if you can't come together on issues, then you're just not going to be effective on actually delivering change for people. And so there's something quite profound about recognising, as you say, Anthony, that it's a broad church. But the difference is you can be a broad church, have your debates, and there'll be some debates you win and you kind of think, this is exactly where I want to go. There'll be other debates, Iain, where, you can see why people wanted to take a slightly different approach, and you have to accept that. But I think it's when you're not willing to accept those differences and you're not willing to show a united front to the public, then that just gets really confusing for people, and I think there's a decision about whether the party wants to be serious about winning. It can be serious about winning, but that is a decision that the party has to take.
Can we just go back to Chris's question? Where he says, does the Conservative Party stand for multiculturalism, yes or no? Just give me a yes or no answer. Seb?
Yes.
Justine?
Yes.
Anthony?
Yes, we're putting it into action.
Chris, you got your answers?
Well, can I just say, Anthony and Seb, last week she talked about foreign-born mothers. If you knocked on my door, my wife would show you the door. She was born in Argentina. She's been here 30 years, paid her taxes and worked hard and contributed to the community. I find that comment, frankly, insulting. And appalling that actually no Conservative MP has really distanced themselves from it, including you two tonight. It's an insult to millions of people that have come to this country and happen to have fallen in love or married a British person or someone else in their country. It makes me sick that the Home Secretary stood up and said that.
Anthony?
Well, my mother was foreign born. But clearly, if you have large amounts of immigration without integration, it clearly causes tensions across different countries, and that's why integration is very, very.
But it hasn't. That's
important.
the point. That we've done a better job than most other countries
we have.
of doing that.
You look at France, you look at Germany, you look at a lot
the
of.
Home Secretary
Italy.
didn't feel that she could say that.
No, I think we generally, clearly there's been tensions over the decades, and we all know the different instances of it. But generally, by and large, we've done a good job at getting different communities to understand each other.
But then there's a challenge, isn't there? Because then when we have the furore over Black Lives Matters, and then this is the issue in a sense, because when people put issues on the table and say, yeah, there is racism actually, and there are some areas where things aren't working for people, then there's an unwillingness. That's the risk, to actually confront those issues and say, yeah, that's right actually. And we do need to get them sorted out, and we have to get these issues sorted out. But notwithstanding that, we're losing sight of the fact that broadly, as you said, Iain, actually there have been some real successes, and that shouldn't mean we don't see the challenges we've still got.
Final word from you, Seb.
I just think as Conservatives we've got to rise above it, and I think the language that you just mentioned there is not something that Conservatives should use. That, as Justine and Anthony have both reflected, there is a positive, upbeat story to celebrate here, and we win this argument with the wider country when you talk about it in those positive terms and you don't talk about it in negative things. And there are, of course, points, Anthony, where we do need to focus on integration, but I don't think you do that by denigrating certain elements, and I think that's something that the Conservative Party has long moved away from, and not something we should go back to.
Somebody says here, I never thought I would miss Justine Greening. Sanity as opposed to Sebastian's delusional grasping for a seat.
I don't quite know how to take that, but thank you. Thank you.
It's not grasping for a seat. Actually, applying to be an MP is an honourable thing to do, isn't it?
I'm just telling you what I think about these issues here. I'm not thinking about any seat or what have you. This is a serious debate about something that obviously matters to a lot of people. And I think that, you can, if you look at what the Home Secretary has said, she has her perspective. She uses language and a tone that I don't think necessarily shares by the people on this panel. It's not what I would use. But I think ultimately you've got to look at these things as they're said, not just what people have preconceived ideas about them.
Right, we will move on in just a few moments' time. But first, let's get the latest news headlines on LBC. It's 8:32. Here's Andy Ivey.
Downing Street insists no final decisions have been made over axing the northern leg of the high-speed rail line between Birmingham and Manchester. Neither the Chancellor nor the Transport Secretary, Mark Harper, mentioned the future of HS2 in their party conference speeches today, despite continued reports that it'll be scaled back. Former US President Donald Trump claims his fraud trial is a scam and election interference. He's been in a court in New York to face allegations of inflating the value of his assets by billions of dollars to secure better loan and insurance terms. Last month was the UK's joint warmest September on record. Provisional figures show the average mean temperature across the country was 15.2 Celsius, equalling data from 2006. LBC weather: rain and some thundery showers across much of England and Wales tonight. Clear spells and showers elsewhere. Lows of between 9 and 15 degrees.
This is LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC. Call 0345 6060 973.
8:35 here on LBC. We've just spent the last 3 minutes debating who was Home Secretary before Suella Braverman. Anyway, let's move on. We have with us Anthony Browne, Conservative MP for South Cambridgeshire, Justine Greening, former Cabinet Minister and Social Mobility campaigner, and Sebastian Payne, Director of the Onward think tank. Now, Hassan in Westminster is on the line. Hassan, what would you like to ask?
Yeah, hi. With the Senate Republicans blocking financial aid to Ukraine and the Prime Minister being reluctant to send troops on the ground, and I guess the Ukrainian offensive has stalled, is it time? How can we help Zelensky? Is it time to call for a ceasefire?
Well, the US Congress narrowly avoided a government shutdown over the weekend by voting for a measure put forward by the right of the Republican Party which limits any further aid for Ukraine. Meanwhile, Rishi Sunak has ruled out any British troops being sent to Ukraine anytime soon to help train Kyiv's forces after Defence Secretary Grant Shapps suggested this could happen. Anthony, let's start with you on this one.
So, I think it's very important that we support Ukraine as much as possible. I completely understand and support the fact the Prime Minister doesn't want to put troops on the ground, because that would be direct conflict with Russia, and that would risk massive escalation. We need to supply them with the equipment that they need, and the UK has obviously led the way in that. Whatever stage of equipment it is, we've given them more equipment. I think it's unfortunate the US has taken this particular turn at the moment. I'm sure they'll come back and start providing support again for Ukraine, but it remains as important now as it was 18 months ago. The Ukraine wins against Russia, and that Russia is seen to lose.
But this US vote, I think we've got to take seriously, haven't we? If Donald Trump becomes president, I mean, that was a signal of what he might do. And I don't quite know what the rest of NATO does in those circumstances.
It would be a very, very difficult situation, absolutely, if you've got the biggest power in NATO not supporting the most important military action there is in the world, absolutely. But I think we as the UK and Europe, the different European nations that have been supporting Ukraine, we should just carry on supporting Ukraine. And Ukraine is on our soil. It is directly, it's for Europe, it's a frontline state in a way that it just isn't for America.
Isn't it a little worrying, though, that we're getting slightly different messages from the Defence Secretary and the Prime Minister?
I think broadly the messages are the same, though. We need to support Ukraine.
But when Grant Shapps more than hints that he might be in favour of some troop deployment or more training for Kyiv's forces in the future, and the Prime Minister says something which is clearly different.
There's a difference. I mean, you can read different things into this, but there's a difference between having troops on the ground where they are in direct conflict with Russia and training Ukrainian troops. So, for example, if we supply fighter jets to Ukrainian troops, pilots, they need massive training for that. They're not going to suddenly get into those planes and read instruction manuals without training. And the same for the tanks, the same for all the equipment we send them, we need to train them. And that is fair enough. But that is very different from having troops on the ground in direct conflict with Russia. And I don't think the Defence Secretary wants the UK to be in war with Russia. I don't think the Prime Minister wants the UK to be in war with Russia. I don't think the people of Britain want the UK to be in a direct war with Russia. But supporting Ukraine in its fight to survive as an independent country, I think we're all in favour of that.
So,
I think what the Senate has done is a huge mistake here, and we have to be very unequivocal about this, because the fact is the UK's military support for Ukraine is, on some sense, piggybacked off what America has been doing. That what we do is important, but it's simply, a lot of it is based on what America does. So if Donald Trump was to become president again and either cut a deal with Vladimir Putin or tried to cut significantly back the aid, that would leave us in an almost impossible position, because we would still be providing our weaponry and our information and our intelligence, but would not be anywhere near as effective. And I actually think that policymakers in the UK right now need to be arguing and calling out this stuff, because obviously we always say we want to work with America and collaborate with them, but the Ukraine war is such an important thing. We have to keep working with America on this. And I think with regards to the UK and troops on the ground, obviously we have been very strategic in how we've deployed resources, because if we were to put troops on the ground, the number of them is not going to make a significant difference to where the war is going. What it's about is where we can be effective, and that's with the NLAWs, with weaponry, it's with obviously fighter jets, it's with tanks, it's all that stuff we need to keep doing, but we need to be making the case with America, and they don't go down this America first, just turning in on themselves, because that could lead to disaster.
Justine Greening.
So I think one of the things that really concerns me is as Development Secretary, I obviously dealt with the Syria crisis and the huge refugee crisis that came from that, and actually in the end was one of the seeds that drove, I think, the Brexit vote in a way, because the international community didn't respond enough to that crisis. So we saw refugees leaving Syria, and then 2 years after that, a sense that they had in their refugee camps that no more help was coming, and so they start to think, right, we've just got to make our own way. But the key thing for Putin there was he had this sense clearly that we were just going to run out of time on supporting Syria, and that all he had to do really was just hang in there with President Assad. And my big concern is that is exactly what he's doing here in Ukraine. He's just waiting us out. His best case scenario, I think, in his mind is a President Trump victory, and I guess it is staggering to think that maybe his biggest ally, effectively in practice, could be the US president after the next election. But he's absolutely waiting out this election. And in the meantime, I think my concern is that sometimes in politics and in diplomacy, there's a window that's steadily closing. And you don't always know that you're at that moment until it's shut, at which point then you suddenly realise it's too late. And I worry that we've had a window to really support Ukraine, and we've not used it as much as we could do, and we'll live to regret that. So I think on the plus side, I would say I think the European solidarity, including the UK, has actually been far greater than we might have expected. But there's a real question mark on this vote this week and what happens in America, and I think it's a warning to Europe to work out what its game plan is if we can't rely on the US as much as we have been able to in the past, in the future, in relation to Ukraine. And you asked what happens next, Ian. The big risk of what happens next is that if we aren't able to have a successful strategy to support Ukraine, that actually China thinks, Taiwan.
Yeah.
Maybe if America really has vacated the international stage in terms of defence and security, maybe this is a good time.
And we have to recognise that if that happened, there's absolutely nothing we can do about it.
I think we have to recognise that for some time now, both China and Russia have shown very clearly, and indeed stated, that they do not believe in an international rules-based order. I sat on the UN Security Council, and it took us 2 years to even get a Security Council resolution passed to get aid into Syria to support some of those places like Aleppo.
You've actually sat on that sort of hemisphere?
Yes, yeah, I chaired it.
Did you?
In fact, once, which was an incredible experience. It was the UK chair. But, in both cases, you saw Russia and China often blocking those votes. So this is what they are seeking to do. And therefore, there's a lot at stake, as many have said, in relation to what happens in Ukraine and more broadly, because it's about protecting some kind of rules-based approach to the world.
So when you were chairing that, did imposter syndrome completely kick in? It would with me. I'd think, oh my God, what am I doing here?
I think somehow I'd prepared so well that it didn't. And I also thought...
Well, good on you.
I also thought it was just this incredible opportunity. And I think I was really proud because I think we could be proud of the UK. I mean, there we were, having our agenda, putting key issues of security and humanitarian aid on the agenda. And I think for me, certainly then in government, I really felt like we shaped the response in Syria, for example. And we were shaping the thinking on the Security Council in terms of defence and security. And I think that's something that we should seek to continue to do as a country.
Right, if you'd all put your mobile phones away now, you can probably guess what the next question is going to be about. It's 9:15.
LBC.
now.
Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC.
We have a cracker of a fun question for the end of the programme, which I'm going to read you out now. Gives our panel a bit of a chance to prepare. But also, I want to hear your suggestions on the text 84850. This is from Jen in Aberdeen. The story behind Live Aid is being turned into a musical next year. Which famous story from the history of the Conservative Party would you want to see turned into a musical? I'll give you a start of a 10. No, no, no. Next question from Linda in Peterborough. That was faintly creepy, wasn't it? Is it really possible to ban mobile phones from schools? That's what Gillian Keegan, the Education Secretary, has announced today, that all mobile phones are going to be banned from the classroom. Some of us thought they already were. Now, Justine, you were Education Secretary. Would this have been top on your list of announcements for this conference?
Not top, but I do think it probably is time just to give schools some clear guidance. So I think
guidance, one thing, but...
Yeah, like I say, maybe not top, but I think it's probably time to be quite clear that schools are for learning and you want children to concentrate. I'm sure most teachers found out about it through a text, but that's okay in the class, in the staff room, I guess.
But 60% of schools already ban them. So you just sort of thinking, is this just one of these? One of the SPADs in the Department of Education said, we've got to have some announcement, and this was the best that they could come up with. It's not very innovative, is it, Anthony?
So I strongly support it. I think that mobile phones are a massive distraction in school. I speak as someone who's got 2 kids. It's worked really well in France. You say 60% of schools ban them. There are a variety of different types of bans. Do you let them have them in break time, for example? Do you let them, have them in free times, whatever? I think actually the model that the government is proposing, where they give their phones in at the beginning of the school day and they pick them up at the end of the school day and have a completely phone-free school day, it's probably further than a lot of schools go. I think it's good that it's that guidance has been given to schools, and I think it's good that they don't have that distraction in class. Clearly, it's good that they don't have all the bullying and social media and obsession that goes on in break times about who's saying what about who and what photos are being sent, etc. I think it's really good for kids, because actually the phones, they're designed in a way to totally obsess people's brains. It's totally addictive, and the children are growing up with this addiction being sort of built into them. It's like a drug, and actually they need to have a serious amount of time away from that, and so I fully support it. And it is, when Justine Greening was Education Secretary, phones were not as prevalent as they are now. I mean, I know it was not
it wasn't that long ago.
But it's become.
It wasn't the 18th century.
But it's become a bigger and bigger issue just in the last few years. And younger kids are getting them. And the social media has become a lot more addictive to young children in the last few years, and I think it just isn't good for children, their development, and so I fully support this.
It's actually an Onward policy that my think tank came with a couple of years ago. We are.
You weren't there a couple of years ago.
Well, thank you for that. You haven't made it on our parade. I will take institutional credit for that. My predecessor, who is now the Prime Minister's Deputy Chief of Staff, was the one who came up with that particular policy. But you're completely right. The key thing about this is what it does to chemical balance levels within children's brains, and all of us have been sitting here and all in our own capacity been looking at our phones for various reasons, and that's because our attention spans are probably equivalent to a small squirrel. Now, what smartphone
you see? In front of him here.
Well, I was only doing that for effect. But the thing is, particularly on Cross Question, when we're streaming it live, often I will get texts on my screen from here saying, it's really rude, one of your panellists is looking at their phone while another panellist is answering. So I give 2 bits of advice to panels before this programme normally. One is, don't look at your phones while somebody else is speaking, and second, don't keep banging on the desk. And you haven't done that, any of you, without me even telling you today, so that's good.
It's almost like we've been here before, but I would just say on the phone ban, the fact that it's not as if kids don't have tech in the classroom, that most schools now provide iPads and devices and laptops that they can use, which are focused on education. The fact is, kids are not using their phones for that, and some of the research we did at Onward showed that this was not the case. When we did surveys of teachers, when they confiscated phones, they were nearly always being used people to mess each other within classrooms about what was going on within school. So it's completely right that they are not part of the school day, and it's better for their mental health, for their well-being, and for their education.
But there will no doubt be exemptions as well. So, like if you're a diabetic and you want to measure your blood sugar on your phone, you can't stop a kid doing that, can you? That would be ridiculous.
No, of course. But like again, again, what we're talking about here is standardised guidance across the education system, which of course there will be exemptions when they are needed, but at the moment it's on a much more piecemeal basis. So I think it's a great thing that it's clarity from the top what schools should do.
Whatever happened to localism? I mean, all parties mouth localism and then they come up with policies like this, which is a one-size-fits-all.
Well, thankfully, Conservatives can do both, Ian.
Really? We can be dictatorial and believe in localism.
You can do
That's
both.
what Rory Stewart believes.
You can have areas where it's good to take power as close to the people as possible, but have other areas where it's cleanest and simplest to have top-down decisions.
Right. Peter is in Reading. He says, does the panel think it's acceptable for a cabinet minister to spout conspiracy theories in their keynote speeches? I'm obviously asking in reference to Mark Harper and 15-minute cities. I have no clue what this refers to, but it says on my screen here, the Transport Secretary said today that what is sinister and what we shouldn't tolerate is the idea that local councils can decide how often you go to the shops and that they ration who uses the road and when, and they police it all with CCTV. I'm a bit of a loss here. Can anyone shed any light on this?
Well, I'm aware. Do you want to go, Anthony, you first?
I thought they were attempting to do this in Oxford, and they actually partitioned the way people could travel around Oxford. Maybe I'm spreading conspiracy theory here, but there definitely were local authorities thinking about this in terms of reducing transport, and there was a lot of.
I think there's been a bit of a row in Ashford, or is it Canterbury?
But isn't this just local democracy? You know, literally, people have voted in the council. They're trying to look at Sadiq Khan, and Boris actually brought in tons of cycle lanes. If you talk to any taxi driver, they will tell you they've driven them up the wall.
You're speaking like a former transport secretary.
But it's but in a sense, this is how it works. People try stuff, and some people like it, some people don't. But we live in a world where, you know, it has to be designed, as you say, Ian, into a conspiracy theory that somehow there's these bigger powers out there who are trying to control our lives. Actually, it's just local authorities.
Well, I'm a bit annoyed with Mark Harper because he did our For the Many Live podcast last night in Manchester at the wonderfully named Bread Shed. It was on a
Did it serve bread?
It was no, I don't think it did, but it was on a street where you wondered sort of it was one of the main drug dealing streets in Manchester. It sort of looked a bit like that. But he never mentioned this to us last night.
Well, 15-minute cities have gone this place where, as you said, Anthony, they have been a real thing, and it goes beyond just cycle lanes and what have you. It's about actually trying to direct people and how they live their lives and where they go. And
is it really, Seb?
That is what the base of it is. But it has been extrapolated. If you let me finish a minute, Justine, this was something that was done in a planning basis. It's now been extrapolated by social media into this grand conspiracy theory that links together lots of other stuff. And I think what the Transport Secretary was talking about is the Oxford example that Anthony was referring to.
But is it sensible? I guess that's the question then. Is it sensible, knowing that for some people this is a conspiracy theory, to then talk about the same phrase in relation to government policy?
Mark Harper is going to do a phone-in with us on the show soon, so people can phone in and ask him to their heart's delight.
Hopefully no conspiracy theorists phone in.
Hopefully
Yes, they will.
No, we don't have them on this show. We leave that to other channels, he says carefully. Right, let's go to Sam in Cambridge, who says, what's the point of a party conference? We, the public, just want to hear about changes in the law, new laws, and honest, frank, simply put, party direction. This can be done via TV and radio, rather than at a no doubt costly jamboree. Seb?
Well, first of all, party conferences bring a lot of money into the cities they do them. I think Manchester is going to make something like £10 million. The local economy is being injected. So on a financial basis, they have a purpose. On a political basis, I mean, party conferences are a moment where members of the party and obviously the media come to scrutinise them, to figure out where things are going, what are the debates are happening. We've talked a lot about what's happened on the fringes of party conference. And ever since I covered them as a journalist and have attended them in my capacity as Onward this first year, the fringes are most interesting. That's where you get real policy debate. You don't often see those on the news headlines, but that's where you can start to really chart where the future of the country is going and what ideas are going to go into the future. And of course you can just see things in news headlines, but it's not the same of actually being there. And party conferences obviously measure a temperature of what is going on in a party. And in a couple of days' time, Rishi Sunak will have done his main speech, and people will say about where his premiership is, and then next week it'll be for Keir Starmer. It's very different from the House of Commons because you've got the party faithful here together, and they're with their own in some respect, and that's a very different thing from with MPs.
Justine?
I think it is a great time when activists can come together. It's often the one time of the year when people see one another. But there's also something for me about it's a bit old-fashioned as well, and maybe there does come a time when you want to reform it and make it a bit more accessible to people as well. It's quite expensive, I think, for activists coming to conferences.
Yeah, go back to Blackpool.
You've got to take days off, holidays, which not everybody is able to do. So I wouldn't mind seeing all three parties work out whether they could do something in a way that's more affordable and more accessible to more people who are actually part of the party, and not just people who can afford, well, best part of several £100s to stay in Manchester. Not that I don't enjoy staying. I love Manchester.
She added hastily.
But I guess I'm just saying it's expensive.
Main advocate of
It's
levelling up
expensive.
slags off Manchester. That
I
would
love
be
Manchester.
a brilliant headline.
It's obviously, for me, from Sheffield, different side of the Pennines.
Okay, Anthony.
So I think party conferences are a great event. They're great, as Seb was saying, for debates and encouraging new debates and seeing the political direction they're going. But actually also just not just activists, but charities, businesses, the media, all getting together in one place and exchanging ideas and speaking to each other. And I think that's a really important democratic function. It happens, there's a reason why all political parties do this. If we didn't do it, everyone would be saying, why don't you just get everyone together and talk at least once a year? In fact, we do it twice a year because we have a spring conference. And long may it last.
Right, our fun question from Jen in Aberdeen. The story behind Live Aid is being turned into a musical next year. Which famous story from the history of the Conservative Party would you want to see turned into a musical? Justine?
Brexit, the musical.
I think there is one, isn't there?
Definitely. It'll make you laugh, it'll make you cry.
You nearly sang that. You wanted to, didn't you? I can tell. Anthony?
The only bit of singing I was thinking about the Conservative Party was Norman Lamont in the bath, singing in the bath.
Oh no, let's not even visualise that.
Black Wednesday, the musical. You wouldn't want to put it on stage, would you? I think it has to be Liz Truss, the musical, doesn't it? There's so much drama there.
Seb?
I'm going to go for the long-running battle between Michael Gove and Boris Johnson, which I think would echo Hamilton, which of course was Alexander Hamilton and Aaron Burr, their long-standing rival. And that one ended with a duel where Hamilton was shot dead. We've not quite got that ending for this, but of course we're down with that late-night phone call where
there was a bit of stabbing.
Faster than Brexit as well, I guess.
It would be a bit faster than
Boris and
Brexit.
Gove.
Exactly, be more personality-driven. I'm really not sure. I mean, every time I think about Brexit and reliving that, Justine, the idea of watching a musical about it, I'm not sure you'd get too many people going to see that.
Don't know, that metropolitan elite down in London might just love it.
I wouldn't want to go.
Show Brexit as a
where do you live, Justine?
I'm being ironic.
Not in Manchester.
I know you are. Right, thank you very much to all three of you. Tomorrow on Cross Question, we have the Policing Minister, Chris Philp, the Mail on Sundays, Anna Mikhailova, and the pollster, James Johnson. But coming up in the next hour, Idris Elba says he's been in therapy for the past year because he's an absolute workaholic. The actor and DJ, known for his roles in Luther and The Wire, said he recently realised he had an unhealthy relationship with work, finding 10 days straight on in a film set more relaxing than being at home with his family. He said that although he did not want to cut back on his workload, he had unhealthy habits that he would like to change. Is he talking for you? He's kind of talking for me. I am an absolute workaholic, and I fully admit it. Andrew Marr is exactly the same. I think a lot of people in our industry are. But what about you? Are you a workaholic? And what have you done to try and lessen your workaholicness? Oh dear.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom.